What's going on, everybody? This is Will Catcher Reptiles, and in today's video we're going to be going over feeding your bearded dragon dark leafy greens. What kind of greens you should feed them, how often you should feed them, and then what you need to keep in mind when feeding your bearded dragon dark leafy greens. Let's get into it. Alrighty guys, so now when it comes to what kind of greens you want to feed your bearded dragon, or what we're going to be feeding our bearded dragons today, this is going to be a great example of a nice varied selection of dark leafy greens to feed your dragons. So on my right we have some collard greens. These are going to be one of the healthiest greens to feed your bearded dragon, followed by some chicory. This is going to be awesome as a little bit of more so a treat kind of green. It's not necessarily as great as something like collard greens may be. And then we also have some Swiss chard. So now same thing is going to be said for the Swiss chard as it's going to be said for the chicory. It's not something that I would feed as often as, say, dandelion or collard greens. However, they are going to be an awesome addition to your bearded dragon's diet. And keep in mind, guys, variety is going to be key. The last thing that you're going to want to do is feed your bearded dragon just collard greens, just dandelion greens, or something of that nature. You're going to want to give them variety. Now, with that being said, some of the greens in which we're going to want to exclude from their diet or keep in their diet to a very minimal extent. So, for example, once a month you can feed some of these greens. Now, that doesn't mean you can feed all of these greens, a couple times every single month, or that I would do so. But, once or twice a month, you can certainly offer things like broccoli, kale, and things of that nature. Things are going to be higher in oxalate content and that kind of thing. So essentially with these greens right here, they're going to be relatively low in their oxalate content, meaning that they're relatively low in calcium binders. So now when it comes to picking out the right dark leafy greens for your bearded dragon, one of the most important things in which we take into account is going to be whether or not they are high in oxalates, which are going to act as a calcium binder in your dragon. So now essentially what a calcium binder is going to do is it's going to bind to calcium, therefore not allowing your dragon to really use calcium in the proper ways. Another thing in which we're going to want to make sure is that we're not feeding things such as lettuces, iceberg lettuce, green leaf lettuce, or romaine lettuce. While romaine and green leaf may be used as an occasional treat here and there really is no productive use for it in terms of your bearded dragon's diet. If it's all you can get and you're mixing it in with dandelion greens once or twice a month, I'm sure it's not going to harm them. However, on the long term, or feeding it to your dragon long term, it's certainly not going to be a productive use of feeding. So with that being said, these are going to be some of the easiest greens to get typically. We're on Long Island, so these are some of the most easily available to me. Keep in mind, we're also feeding quite oftentimes, things like escarole, dandelion greens, prickly pear cactus pads and things like that once they're despined and all that kind of stuff. And then occasionally we'll add things in such as bell peppers and things of that nature to add a little bit more variety in their diet. But let's get into preparing these and showing you guys how you should prepare these greens for your dragons. Alrighty, so now when it comes to preparing greens for your bearded dragons, basically the most important thing is going to be, number one, that we're using greens that are going to be essentially edible for you. If they're not good enough for you to eat, they're not good enough for your dragon to eat. So now essentially what this means is going to be that we're picking off any bits of the greens in which are not, good looking, to say the least. So any bits of the greens that are really starting to yellow out, brown out, or get otherwise disgusting, we're just going to take right off of them. And then as far as the greens themselves, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we are thoroughly washing them, making sure that there's no pesticides or anything like that left on them. If you guys can get organic greens, that's certainly better, but I would still recommend rather thoroughly washing them, rinsing them, and making sure that you're feeding your bearded dragon greens that are going to be nice, healthy, and safe for them. So this means that we're not going to have any leftover insects on the greens from them being grown outdoors. This means that there's not going to be any pesticides on the greens or anything like that, no waxy substances or anything of that nature. That's certainly something in which you're going to want to keep in mind when feeding your bearded dragon greens. One of the other things in which you're going to want to keep in mind is that a lot of these greens that we just had mentioned are going to have relatively large stems on them. So essentially what I'll typically do is we're going to start off by washing each one of these leaves off nice and thoroughly, making sure that they're nice and clean for the dragons to eat. If there's anything that's going to fall into the sink, I'm typically just pulling that right off, and we're just going to wash it right under the sink. Get it nice and rinsed off, get it into our feeding tray for the day. Now keep in mind, when you guys see me preparing all of these greens, this is not for one bearded dragon for a week. This is going to be for multiple bearded dragons for a day. Yeah, that's right. This is going to be what our bearded dragons are typically going to go through on a day-to-day basis. As far as your bearded dragon, you know, probably one or two of these leaves are gonna suit your bearded dragon for an entire day, especially if it's a younger bearded dragon or a young juvenile or a baby. Honestly, probably half of one of these leaves or half of two of these leaves, this way you can still offer them variety. It's gonna be more than good enough to keep your bearded dragon fed, happy, and healthy for the day. Obviously, you know, we don't wanna be wasteful or anything like that. But now keep in mind, as you can see, I'm rather thoroughly washing these greens. We aren't just holding them under the water. We're actually washing them off. We're using our hands, and we're making sure that there's nothing on these greens. No dirt, no waxy substances, nothing like that. You will notice that depending on where you source your greens from and whether they're organic or not, or organically grown or not, they may be a little bit more challenging to make sure that you wash them to your fullest capabilities. Now keep in mind, we're pulling off any stringy bits of stems, and we're also pulling off any stems that are going to be damaging to your bearded dragon or hard for your bearded dragon to digest. Typically, if it's a stem in which you can't see your bearded dragon biting through in one go, we're just going to take that and we're just going to take that right off of the leaf itself. This way your bearded dragon doesn't have to worry about, you know, or you don't have to worry about your bearded dragon really eating that stem and potentially choking on it or having a difficult time passing it through their digestive tract or anything like that. A lot of people are typically concerned strictly when it comes to bugs and digestion and things of that nature. However, when it comes to dark leafy greens, that's certainly something that we do also want to keep in mind, is how can our bearded dragon digest these greens and all that kind of stuff. If there are any, you know, dense stems or anything like that within the greens, then I certainly would just cut them off, flip them off, use your fingernail and peel them off the leaf itself. This way we don't have to worry about the bearded dragon accidentally ingesting them. And now as far as the temperature of water in which we're just going to be using typically room temperature water, just washing these greens off. You don't really want to use hot water. You don't want to be feeding your bearded dragon wilted or soggy greens or anything like that. And in terms of the purpose behind that, let's keep in mind, guys, that bearded dragons, especially adult bearded dragons in which you may not be offering bugs to on a day-to-day basis, or you may be offering small amounts of bugs to on a day-to-day basis, the primary amount of their water intake for that day is going to come from their dark leafy greens. So the last thing in which we would want to do is feed them greens that are wilted, soggy, or that don't have much water content. You may also notice that when I'm taking these greens, you know, right out from under the sink, they are relatively wet. Keep in mind that that's, you know, a somewhat good thing, assuming that your tap water is not incredibly harsh with chlorine or chloramides or things like that. You know, you can't smell the chlorine in your water. Your tap water is otherwise safe for you to drink. You know, and it seems as though it's safe for your bearded dragon to drink. Obviously, you know, you want to use some of your own critical thinking skills involved in this process. You don't want to be just using tap water because you see me using tap water to wash your greens. If your greens are incredibly harsh, you know, you may look to rinse them off under a different kind of water. Keep in mind things such as RO water could be useful if you have a hard time finding water in which may be suitable for your dragon. Certain people will also use products such as Reptiles, and then they'll dry their greens off, you know, and then furthermore from there, use a spray bottle full of water that has been treated with the Reptiles, and they'll moisten the greens slightly, essentially ensuring that the bearded dragon is going to be receiving greens that are relatively similar to how they would eat them in the wild. Keep in mind, when we're talking about plants in the wild and things of that nature, essentially these plants are typically every morning going to be covered in dew and things such as that. You know, some form of condensation is going to be present on the majority of plants outside. So with that being said, you know, bearded dragons are certainly not only going to get a lot of their moisture content through eating their greens, but sometimes we'll certainly get it through licking their greens or licking their greens to see if they're moist and to see if they can get any water or potential hydration from those greens in general. And now keep in mind what I said in terms of, like, you know, if there's anything on the greens in which isn't suitable, we're just going to pluck that off. We're going to rinse these off, and we're going to make the greens basically essentially as usable as possible. You're not going to throw out your greens just because there's a little bit of yellowing on the tip of one of them. However, oftentimes, you know, we'll just take that section, trim it off, and then proceed to feed the rest of that plant to the animals. You know, it's one of those things where we certainly, like I said, you don't want to waste a whole bunch of grains, especially when you're feeding large amounts of bearded dragons. The last thing that we want to do is say, oh wait, this one's a little bit yellow on the end of it, and then just throw the whole leaf out altogether when it's a perfectly usable leaf. So that's certainly something to keep in mind as well. Alrighty, so I'm going to get to washing all these greens, and then we'll snap back to you guys, and I'll show you guys a little bit of how I process them down, and then how we're going to actually be offering them to our dragons. So I'll see you guys in a moment. Alrighty guys, so now we got all these greens washed off, so now we're gonna get into how we're gonna cut these up, how we're gonna chop these up, and what we're gonna do to make them edible for our dragons today. So, one of the things in which is gonna be relatively useful is gonna be a nice pair of either kitchen shears or scissors. So now when it comes to chicory, the nice thing about it is typically the stems on it are gonna be relatively thin. So typically what we'll do is we'll just typically cut the bottom off, cut off any leafy bits that are on here that are still usable, just like so. And then we're gonna leave it like that, take that stem and we're gonna put it elsewhere for now. I'm just gonna continue this process for the rest of this chicory that we got, cutting out any leaves that are still left on here. Typically on the outside, the stems are gonna be thicker than on the inside. It's just gonna be, typically leafy matter, which makes chicory one of the more usable greens in terms of using everything in which you pay for. Whereas, as you're gonna see with something like these collard greens, typically there's a wide amount of stem in which you're gonna typically not feed directly to the dragon. In terms of, limiting waste product and things of that nature, typically one of the best uses for things such as these stems is going to usually be for feeding your feeder insects. So essentially what this will do is, a lot of the nutrients in which we wish to pass on to the dragon, through giving them these dark leafy greens, we can essentially also give to their feeder insects. So I know a lot of old school folks are typically going to use things such as carrots or potatoes or things of that nature to feed to their insect. While this may be beneficial, at least in terms of carrots for animals such as chameleons, for bearded dragons where typically vitamin A issues are not as prevalent, or at least a lack of vitamin A is typically not an incredibly huge issue, in which is seen in bearded dragons. Typically feeding their feeder insects things like carrots or things of that nature, in which are incredibly high in vitamin A, is not exactly going to be the most useful of things. So when it comes to actually finding a good source of food for your feeder insects, and which is going to act as, in many cases, both a food and water source for the feeders, personally I really like using these stems. So whether that be the stems of collard greens or the stems of something like, escarole or even chicory or Swiss chard, it certainly is quite beneficial. So now you'll notice, like I said, there is certainly a decent amount of stem in which we're going to be putting off to the side. And like I said, keep in mind, this doesn't necessarily have to be waste product. When it comes to our facility and things of that nature, it certainly is not waste product. This is something in which we use, like I said, for our feeder insects, in particular our crickets, our mealworms, our superworms, and all that kind of stuff. This makes an excellent gut load for them. It's really nice to kind of pass along those nutrients into your feeders, which then is going to be passed right along into your dragons. We don't feed any of our crickets or our dubia roaches or our superworms, our mealworms, anything like that. None of them eat potatoes from the second we unbox them until the second that they are fed to the dragon, which is typically a couple of days apart. We try to let them kind of sit and gut load on some beneficial foods before we actually feed them to our animals. Basically what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to actually feed our animals the healthiest feeder insects in which we could possibly get our hands on, just because we know that they've been fed nothing but the best in terms of healthy foods and things of that nature. So now keep in mind, if you are using large amounts of Swiss chard, at least to my knowledge, the stems on Swiss chard are going to be relatively high in water, relatively insignificant in terms of vitamin content, actual food content, and things of that nature. So this is certainly going to be an extra reason to use variety on a day-to-day basis. This way you aren't feeding your crickets, just something that's going to be incredibly high in moisture content. You're also feeding them something that's going to be relatively useful in terms of them actually passing along nutrients to your animal. So now while we do use certain insect gut loads here and there, for the majority of the time, we really do use, the stems of our greens to feed our insects. We've had nothing but success doing so. It keeps our insects nice and healthy, and then it also keeps our dragons nice and healthy. We're not, trying to feed our dragon waste product when it comes to the greens, which would obviously be the stems and things of that nature. But we're also getting our feeder insects, fed on foods that would otherwise be healthy for the dragons. Like I said, the stems in particular, stuff like collards and dandelions and even the Swiss chard, certainly do contain, certain important vitamins and minerals and other important and healthy components in which we would like to pass on to our dragons or your other omnivorous reptiles. However, like I said, the dragons are going to have a relatively hard time breaking down these dense, rather thick stems. I mean, you can tell, this is a rather dense, kind of stringy, thick kind of stem, so it's not going to be the best thing to try to feed your bearded dragon stems of the dark leafy greens. That's certainly something in which we try to avoid. So now when they're relatively thin bits of stem, it's not something that I would be all too concerned about, when it's a little teeny, extremely thin piece of stem. However, when it's something that's really pretty thick like you're seeing right here, that's certainly something in which we're going to be cutting right off the greens. We're not going to be processing this down and feeding it to the dragons in any way, shape, or form other than through their feeder insects. So now, as you guys will notice, I'm just kind of, depending on what greens we're actually getting down here, we're going to process it slightly differently. Nothing overly complicated. Like I said, essentially what we're doing is we're cutting the greens off the greens and we're leaving the stems as the stems. And like I said, this is certainly something that's going to be relatively important. You don't want to leave this up to, the animal's discretion. They're really not going to know any better a lot of the time. Sometimes they may try not to eat the stem. Other times they may just see greens and they just may go to town on them. And like I said, this can cause, some degree of complications when it comes to actually breaking down the stems and things of that nature. So now from here, what we're going to do is we're going to get these greens all nice and chopped up, processed down. We are feeding a vast array of dragons, so we're going to cut these down possibly a little bit thinner than you may wish to. If you were just feeding adult dragons, but being that we feed a large amount of baby bearded dragons on a day-to-day basis, a large amount of juveniles, and a large amount of adults, we've certainly noticed that, the smaller pieces of greens, the adults still entertain for sure. They really have pretty much zero problem when it comes to eating their greens. However, we have noticed that if the pieces are too large, it can certainly cause some complications in terms of getting the babies to eat their greens or making sure that the greens are going to be safe for our baby bearded dragons to eat. Typically what you're going to be looking for is pieces of greens that are no larger than the space in between the animal's eyeballs on the top of their head. So with that being said, if you don't cut these greens up, that's certainly going to be quite the break in that rule. That's not to say that your bearded dragon can't handle eating greens that are going to be slightly larger pieces than the space between its eyeballs, but it doesn't mean it's something that we want to do. It certainly can create a slight bit of a choking hazard and things of that concern. So like I said, we're just going to cut these up, and I'm going to flash back to you guys when we're downstairs and getting ready to actually feed the dragons. See you guys in a moment. Alrighty guys, now we are back in the reptile room. Just wanted to show you guys kind of, for the most part, that was probably a relatively simple concept, but just kind of what these greens are going to look like once we chop them all up. Now let's get into feeding these dragons. Alrighty guys, so now that all the dragons are fed, I just figured I'd show you guys what we're looking at in terms of serving sizes and stuff like that. Usually I'm using these on the tops of Chinese food containers. These work awesome as little plates for some of our groups of adult dragons. Right here we got one of our little trios that we have set up. This is one of our 100% het Wero Donner Leatherback Barbata hybrids. We got them paired up to a het Whiplet female, and we got them paired up to a het Hypotrans female. Produce some nice stuff out of this group, but our main concern obviously is going to be, what the greens look like, how the greens look, do they like the greens, and obviously they do. This is going to be something we'll typically leave in with them for the first couple hours in the morning. And then from there, we'll offer bugs afterwards. We definitely do want to give them, however, a nice little bit of an option in terms of to eat their greens before we even entertain offering bugs or anything like that. As you can see, this is something that we're offering to the vast majority of our breeder groups. Not the vast majority. This is going to be offered to every single breeder group that we have. And then when we got smaller, groups of dragons or single dragons by themselves, we're just going to be using a little deli cup lid that seems to work more than sufficiently. This girl already started to eat some of her greens. Let's see if she'll take any more on camera. You want them? Maybe? No? Okay. But yeah, they'll definitely keep in mind, guys, your dragons are going to eat their greens. It's really just one of those things where, certainly may take a little bit of time. And if you're offering bugs prior to offering your greens or anything like that, anticipate on your dragons not necessarily eating their greens every single time or that kind of thing. And that's something that you certainly want to take into account. you know, you certainly are going to want to offer your grains prior to you offering bugs throughout the course of the day. You know, at least for an hour or two prior to actually offering them bugs, we're going to offer them grains. That's pretty much what it looks like, guys. We got some poops to scoop already, so let me get to that. Just figured I would show you guys kind of what it looks like in terms of, you know, when we get greens in with the dragons and all that kind of stuff. As you can tell, even our hatchlings, you know, we got greens in with these guys. It's a relatively important concept, is that you offer dragons from all ages, all size groups and everything like that, greens, every single day religiously, from our hatchling tubs to our adult cages. We're offering these guys grains on a daily basis. Incredibly important. Definitely something in which you guys are going to want to do. And that's about it, guys. Like, comment, subscribe. Follow us on Instagram at willcatcher.reptiles. Check out our website, www.willcatcherreptiles.com. And until next time, guys, peace.